Hey, thanks for joining us and welcome to the Becoming podcast from Newlife Church. We're so excited to share in this conversation with you today as we explore what it means to become more people, more like Jesus. Happy listening.
Well, friends, welcome to the Becoming podcast. I'm joined by Jess. Jess, it's great to see you again.
Good to see you.
And we've got someone very special to Newlife on the podcast today, the former lead minister, my friend and mentor, Stu Cameron.
Are you excited for this? I feel like you're speaking to, your spiritual father and your mentor that you've had for your entire
I think
career.
I can't understate enough how much that I wouldn't be the man I am today if not for Stu. He called me into ministry. He led me, mentored me, and was just so faithful in allowing the call of God in my life to flourish. So it's brilliant. I mean, are you excited for today's podcast?
Yeah, I'm so excited. I had the blessing of meeting Stu and his wife Sue last year, just very briefly when he was visiting Newlife, and he's just got such a beautiful heart, and the way that he saw me and remembers my name, and I can totally understand why God has placed him where he is now, which is CEO of Wesley Mission, because he's just got such a big heart for people and a big heart for Jesus.
Yeah.
And today we'll be speaking about distance and faith. I'm really excited for this because I know even myself, sometimes I can feel distant with God. I came to faith and had just this like fiery hunger for God. Like it's as if I met the love of my life, had butterflies, all I thought about was him, all I would talk about is him. And then as life has progressed and in different seasons, I have felt that distance with God. And I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah, it's great. I think there'll be a lot of gold. So let's go to the conversation and then we'll come back and unpack.
Great.
Well, it's my deep honor today to welcome Stu Cameron, Reverend Stu Cameron from Wesley Mission down in Sydney. Stu and I actually go way back. Stu's been my mentor, my boss, and my friend for many years. And now I guess you could start to call us colleagues. Stu, it's great to have you with us on the Becoming podcast. It's a good thing to interview today. You'd probably be one of the most influential figures in my spiritual formation out of everyone. In fact, I still remember the day many years ago when I was called into ministry. I don't know if you remember this, but you washed my feet at the end of a prayer and worship night. It changed my life that night. I'm deeply thankful for it, So Stu, tell us a little bit about where you're from, what you're currently up to. You used to be the lead minister of the Newlife family of churches, but you're now doing a far bigger, grander role down in Sydney.
I'm not sure about that. It's a different role, certainly. Yeah, 15 years on the Gold Coast and Southeast Queensland with Sue. We loved that season and so grateful to God for it. But now, for the last 4 years, just ticked over, we've been in Sydney where I'm CEO and superintendent for Wesley Mission. It's an organisation that's 212 years young. It's a church and community services organisation. So we have 8 congregations based here in Sydney in the CBD, but also a couple of the suburbs of Sydney, and a community services organisation that has around 2,000 staff. So spread from Ballina in the north of New South Wales down to Wollongong, various regional locations, but also some suicide prevention networks right around the country as well. So church community services organisation, and our mission is to continue the work of Jesus Christ in word and deed. So after tonight's after this conversation, I'm going to be heading home. I was just saying, sharing with one of your colleagues, leading a prayer meeting with some of our Wesley Mission leaders, and I'll be preaching this weekend. And on Friday, I'll be down in Canberra talking to some of the senior bureaucrats at DSS. So it's quite a diverse role.
Quite a diverse role. I mean, Stu, one of the things I love about you, and you're a hard act to follow, if I could say that easily. I mean, you've been an accountant. You've been a general secretary of a state of our denomination. You've been a lead minister. You're now a CEO and superintendent minister of one of Australia's largest social justice organizations. But the thing that I love the most, I've always loved this about you, is before any of that, you're a disciple of Jesus. And it's one of the things when I think about Stu, I think of a man who still cries when people get baptized, who still rejoices around people who come to know Jesus. And I just thought for a moment, give us a bit of context, Stu, for those who don't know you. How did you become a disciple of Jesus?
Yeah, and look, follower of Jesus is the thing. I am, a child of God. That's my first and foremost identity. I was blessed to grow up in a home where faith was always part of the conversation, and I had a very faithful grandmother who gave me a picture book Bible when I was in primary school that helped me fall in love with the scriptures, even before I fell in love with Jesus who sits behind the scriptures. But when I was 12 years old, I was at an event in Victoria and responded to a call to give my life to Jesus. I didn't go down the front of a church service or anything like that. I was too chicken to do that. I was actually after a service, a rally one night. I was sleeping in the annex of my parents' caravan, and I just prayed this really simple prayer because I was still a bit unsure about all of this, even though I'd grown up in and around the church. I said, God, if you're real, I want you in my life. That was as simple as it got. I want to follow you. And to this day, I'll never forget the sense of being overwhelmed by love. And that feeling has ebbed and flowed over the time, but it's never gone away. I've just been caught up in this loving relationship with God. And for me, that's encapsulated in my favourite verses in Scripture, Romans 8, that nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. And I knew that day that I was held by God, and I've known every day since that I'm held by God. So my testimony, as with all testimonies, is to the faithfulness of God, who has been behind, beside, and before me in all things. Even when I haven't seen it, He's been there. So yeah, that's when my journey started. And I was discipled by some amazing leaders who chose to speak into my life. Women and men who had faithfully followed Jesus for a number of years, and who sacrificially and generously decided to invest in me. And so again, I didn't recognise what a gift that was in the moment, but I have since. So I've had some amazing mentors and people who've discipled me over the years, and I am who I am today because they pointed me to Jesus, which I'm forever grateful for.
Yeah, Stu, unpack that a little bit more for me, because I think that's a really beautiful thing you touch on then. You become a Christian when you're a young man. When I think of our story, one of the greatest gifts you have given me is you've run your race. You are running your race. I've seen you walk through some dark times and some great times. We've laughed together. We've traveled America together, listening to Taylor Swift, a great memory. Yeah. But talk to me a little bit about the importance of mentors for going the distance. Yeah.
And look, I still have people who mentor me, who pastor me. I'm in a role where I'm responsible for a couple of thousand staff, and it's even more important for me now with the responsibilities I have to have people who speak into my life, who can correct me, who can lovingly come alongside me and speak truth into my life, and to have the humility and the willingness to allow that to happen, because iron sharpens iron. That's what the scriptures tell us in Proverbs. And so I've been sharpened by the wisdom and the insight of others who've done that for me over the years. So, I had youth group leaders, back when I was a teenager, then into my young adult years, who so modelled the life of Jesus. I thought, I want to be like them, to the point one of my mentors, who's still one of my mentors today, Craig Bailey, when I turned 18, my parents wanted to buy me a new Bible. and I wanted to have exactly the same Bible as Craig had because I wanted to have whatever he had. So that idea of, Paul said it. He said, imitate me as I imitate Christ.
Yeah.
There were some people in my world that so modeled the life of Jesus, I wanted to imitate them. So having people around you that are further in the journey, and I still have those people to this day who have run the race for longer than me, who've run the race better than me, and I'm still imitating them. And I think that's a good thing to have, and that's a great gift to have those sorts of people in your world.
I think mentors are pivotal, but mentors can't prevent the questions of faith from arising, nor can mentors really prevent you from distance that you feel from God. One of the things that I've heard you talk a lot about, Stu, is the long, dark night of the soul. Talk to me a bit about the place that distance from God or dark periods in your faith has played in who you are today. Because I think a lot of times people think that people like yourself who are ripe, young age of 45 going on 60, you've never really had struggles with your faith, but you and I would both know that that's not the truth at all. What role has distance between God played in your following of Jesus?
Yeah. Oh, look, absolutely. If you've journeyed with Jesus for any period of time, you know that you'll have those seasons where God seems distant, and certainly I've experienced that. Some of that has been self-inflicted. In my late 30s, I was in Adelaide in a really a stressful sort of role of leadership within the life of the church during a time of enormous conflict. And in my pride, I was leading out of my own strength. And cut a long story short, I got to a point where I was burnt out, and God seemed silent. But I came to a point where, because of my own pride and arrogance, I was humbled. In that burnout time, the only place I could turn towards was God. And I'd kept God, in a sense, through my own pride and arrogance, at arm's length. I could do all of this. I was Mr. Fix-It. I was the guy that any challenge, I could tackle and overcome. But I discovered when I came to the end of myself, I found God. That cliche is absolutely true. When I cried out to God, God was there. God hadn't abandoned me. And, that was pivotal for me and still shapes me to this day. We're talking almost 20 years later. I'm still leading out of a place where I know that only in and through God's strength can I do what God is calling me to do. It's not by might, not by power, but by my strength, says God. That's what the prophet says. And I've known that to be true. So there's that self-inflicted pain or that self-inflicted distance. And then there's other times where, not because of anything I've done or anything in particular, but just because I live in a fallen world, because I have a particular personality, in my family. I've gone through seasons of depression, and in those seasons, through the help of Christian counselors and mentors, I've been able to navigate my way through those dark nights of the soul. Now, having said that, people can come alongside you, but it's a journey that in some respects is very isolating. It's a journey that you can only go on your own. But like the prophets who I draw a lot of strength from, like Elijah, like Jeremiah and others, I've seen when they've been humbled and when they've been radically honest with God, that God meets them in that vulnerability, in that honesty, in that openness. And that's certainly been my experience and continues to be my experience today. If anyone was to read my journals, they would think, oh my gosh, who is this guy? Because I pour out my heart to God. And in those pages, in those conversations with God in my journal, I find the God who always meets us at our lowest point.
I'd love you to unpack the journaling thing a bit more for me, because I still remember this moment. You did it often over your 15 years, or at least my time with you at Newlife, where you would preach on this and you would bring your journals with you, and you'd put them on the platform. And it was there's this great quote that says, "You can't fake history with God." And I think for me, when I saw you do that, I knew personally I would often go pick up a journaling spiritual practice. So when I say you've had an impact on my life of spirituality, I'm not being facetious. You literally, practically, I've done the things you've done. So what does journaling look like for you? And has it changed? What are the different practices of journaling that you've experienced?
Yeah, look, I've had to keep that fresh over the years. I mean, it was back in my late 20s, we were living in Tasmania, and I had a pastor there who, I grew up in an environment where spiritual disciplines like journaling and fasting, they were people were a bit suspicious of them. Are you trying to earn your salvation? But I discovered through the writings of people like Richard Foster and Dallas Willard, which I'd always commend to anybody, that spiritual disciplines actually can be a means of grace, a means by which we can encounter God and meet with God. And certainly for me, journaling, because I find prayer really hard. Reading the scriptures, studying, all of those things, that's my sweet spot. Praying, that's really hard for me because my mind wanders. If I close my eyes and I just try to pray that way, if I'm not in a group, I'm just on my own, my mind drifts. What journaling does for me, it gives me focus. It gives me a space, that tactile experience enables me to gather my collected thoughts or my scattered thoughts and be able to make some sense of them. But over the years, I've prayed the scriptures. Right now, I used to pray this. I used to journal the scriptures. I read 3 or 4 chapters out of the New Testament, the Old Testament. Now it would be a chapter maximum, and really just look for that one word, that one phrase, that one verse that really speaks to me, and really just try to draw out all of the nutrients, the spiritual nutrients in that scripture, and pray that and apply that to my life. But other times I'll go through adoration, thanksgiving, confession, and intercession as I just try to pray, writing those prayers out as a form of liturgy before God, if you like. So really, all it is just a way of gathering my scattered thoughts into some sort of cohesive form and giving me that tactile experience before God. It's a sacrament in some senses where I meet God.
Talk to me a bit about the role that spiritual disciplines play in your life. Are they something that is a response to how you're feeling? Do you do them what do spiritual disciplines do to anchor you in your faith?
Yeah. Spiritual disciplines nourish my soul, is in short. Another one for me, Richard Foster talks about study, and for me that's about reading. So I just find, I love reading, and then that could be biography. That could be, I've just read a book by Jonathan Sacks on morality. He's former chief rabbi in Great Britain, and it helps me to love God with my mind. And so it develops my capacity to love God with all of my senses. I mean, I'm an emotional sort of guy, Mike, you know that. So I feel things. One of the things that spiritual discipline enables me to do and helps me to do is to love God not just with my heart, but also with my soul, my mind, and my strength. And which is what the scriptures command us to do, and what Jesus tells us to do, and to love our neighbour as ourselves. So spiritual disciplines help anchor me in that love of God, if you like, and to experience his love as well. So I know that I'm in a good space spiritually when I'm reading lots, when I'm opening my Bible, when I'm journaling regularly. These things are always markers of spiritual health for me, not because they earn God's favour. They're just a means by which I meet with God and open myself up to God.
Do you think there are markers in your life that should be early indicators of a growing distance?
Yeah. If I'm becoming impatient with others, if my love for people, because my world, as your world is people. If I start encountering people as problems or as distractions or as interruptions, I know I'm in trouble. I know that I need to draw aside and spend some time with God and get my heart right. So that's one indicator for me. If I'm, as I said before, if I'm not creating the space, if I'm not motivated to spend time with God in Scripture, or there are days, sometimes days are sequential, days on an end where I don't do that. So look, it's not being legalistic about that, but if that becomes an extended season, I know that then I'm heading for trouble if I'm not in trouble already spiritually. So it's am I spending time and nourishing my own soul and my own spirit? And I remember one of the things I learned in my season at Newlife, if I'm not, I can't lead people to a well that I'm not drinking from myself. If I'm not drawing from that deep well of living water that Jesus offers, I can't offer that water to others as a leader, as a pastor, as a disciple. And so I need to be drawing constantly, because, I without drawing from that well constantly, I'm going to dry up spiritually. So I need to constantly be drawing through whatever discipline works. And different disciplines work for different people. I know people who, in my world, who fast one day every week. That doesn't do it for me, I have to say. I do fast from time to time, but not that regular pattern. So it's finding those things. And that's the great thing about spiritual disciplines, is that different spiritual disciplines will work in different ways for different people, because God has wired us differently. So it's not about, following my pattern. It's finding your pattern before God that fits your personality, your lifestyle, and is going to nourish you.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk to me a bit. If you were to sit down with me, let's say I said to you, hey, Stu, I'm going through profound distance from God. I don't sense him. He's not close. I'm questioning him. What would your counsel be to me as a pastor?
Yeah. The first thing I say is to bring that openly before God. God knows already. Is to, in admitting it to yourself, bring it before God, and perhaps do that with a trusted mentor or a pastor or a friend. When you speak that out loud before God and before others, when you confess that dryness or that distance, that breaks open something. I think even in that moment, it's the beginning of a journey towards healing. So that would be the first thing. There have been times where I've held tightly to that, where I've lived in denial, or I have decided I can just tough this out, and that leads to more pain, not to liberation. So I think humbling ourselves before God, sometimes in the company of others, is incredibly liberating and empowering. So I'd start there first of all. And, I think in the story of women and men in Scripture, we also find people who have those seasons. I mean, recently, reading Elijah's story, who after a moment of great triumph finds himself, curled up under a bush, wishing that he was dead. I can relate to that, where you have these peak moments followed by these incredibly deep valleys. And, God meets him there, feeds him there, nourishes him there. And so I think God is not afraid of our mess. So bring our mess before God and speaking about it openly and vulnerably is the doorway to liberation and to healing.
Stu, the other thing that intrigues me about you is that, like me, you live a very busy life. How do you ensure the busyness of your world, CEO of a big organization, 2,000 employees? How do you ensure the busyness of your world doesn't lead to natural distance with God?
Yeah. One of the most important disciplines for me is the discipline of Sabbath. And even this last weekend, I got to Friday night, and I had a to-do list that was longer than it was on Monday morning. And, the temptation was for me to spend a decent chunk of Saturday, which is my Sabbath, because I had stuff to do on Sunday around church and other things, was to spend a decent chunk of that day, knocking off some of that to-do list. But instead, I went for a 3-hour walk here in Sydney around the harbour. I came home, I mowed the lawns, I read the newspapers, I watched a little bit of Netflix, and it was fantastic. It was just what my soul needed and my to-do list needed. And it was a reminder that at the end of the day, it's not my work, it's God's work. And I know that in a paradoxical way, I'm actually going to be far more fruitful because I took that day where I set aside my work and just spent time with God, spent time in nature. That has been incredibly vital for me. And when I don't create that space, again, if I do that over an extended period of time, that's when the fuel tank will hit the red line. I'll find empty.
Unpack a Sabbath for me. What does Sabbath mean?
Sabbath for me, it's interesting. Here in Sydney, I'm still, even 4 years in. I mean, at Newlife, Fridays was my Sabbath. It was golf in the morning with some friends who weren't part of church. Some lunch with them, and then an afternoon with Sue, and then an evening with friends. It was everything. It was just creating some space to just enjoy neighbours, to enjoy nature, to enjoy some space free of the distraction of to-do lists. Here in Sydney, it's a Saturday, and it involves, as I just said before, a lazy morning, often a walk, a little bit of shopping perhaps, and some reading, some time with my wife, some time with friends. So a Sabbath is a day where the diary is deliberately empty.
Yeah, that's beautiful. One of the to change track just for a second, Stu. One of the things that I admire and respect about you, and another gift you've given to me, is that you have led for so long, seemingly without scandal or reason to be stepped down. In our day and age, Christian leaders getting stepped down left, right, and center. I guess I ask you a question about that. Like, is that just by the grace of God? I think you would say yes, but 100%. I'd push you on it a bit more and go, what are the decisions and sacrifices that you've made to ensure that, after what I think it's like 30 or something years in ministry, you're still leading?
Yeah. And look, I mean, it's a great question, Mike, and it definitely is by the grace of God. I mean, I'm a flawed human being, like we all are, like you are. I know that the human heart is deceitful above all things, as the scriptures tell us, and my capacity for self-deceit, for pride, for arrogance, for idolatry, all of these things is still inherent in me. But God is sanctifying me by his grace. That is, he's transforming me more and more day by day into his image. I know at Newlife, more people more like Jesus. Day by day, by God's grace, I'm becoming more like Jesus. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So it is by God's grace that any growth in my life, spiritual growth, happens. I've also had the opportunity over the last few decades to, I guess, get a front row seat to seeing what happens when, those flaws, lead to, some sort of scandal. And, I've known when I've seen that, I don't want to go down that path. I've seen the damage it causes to that person, to their family, to the churches or the ministry they lead or part of. And I certainly, that's pain that I want to avoid as well. Yeah. So, for me, it's, and I think often where that starts, and no one deliberately starts out for that to happen. No one does. But, we come to a place of, as I did at different points, I could have gone down that path readily. For me, it ended in burnout, didn't end in scandal. It ended in burnout. But hubris, this idea that we can do it in our own strength, that for me seems to be a common thread in those things. It's constantly humbling ourselves before God and before others, and recognising there's God's work, not ours, is absolutely critical. So I think one of the most underrated attributes of effective leadership is humility. There's way too much hubris often in the church,
Yeah.
and we desperately need more humility. And that's what marked Jesus, who humbled himself to the point of crucifixion. That's the one whom we follow. And so humbling ourselves, particularly when we find ourselves in places of responsibility and leadership, is deliberately humbling ourselves in order that we take up a servant's trowel and leave the crowns to Jesus.
That's beautiful, Stu. I mean, when you think about following Jesus, what still excites you about following Jesus?
That I learn stuff all the time. That Jesus surprises me with his grace. The more I grow with Jesus, the more I discover there's more growth to come. So it's just this unfolding adventure. One of the things I love about the journey with Jesus is that it's a journey of adventure. Faith is an adventure that God calls us into, and I never expected to be serving in the role that I am, to be living in Sydney, to have the opportunities that we have here, as challenging as it is. So, I often will shake my head, and Sue and I will talk about the different twists and turns that this adventure has taken us on. We've lived in 4 different states. We've served in different roles, different churches, and seen God do amazing things. And for me, it's the surprise. It's constantly being surprised by the grace of God, and particularly in our own lives, as well as seeing that in the lives of others.
Yeah,
I love about this journey.
When you think about those last days, which are many years in the future, Stu, let's say one day we erect a tombstone for Stu Cameron.
Yeah.
What does the dash represent?
I hope what that will say, well, not so much what that will say, but what I will hear in that moment is, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into your rest. That's my heart's desire, that with all of my frailties and fallibilities, that Jesus, I'll hear those words from Jesus, and that the legacy, if there's a legacy of my life, is that others will have come to know Jesus and have grown in Jesus because of, in some way, because of my example, in some small way. That would be, that nothing beats that. You touched on this earlier. To this day, I just heard a story here recently of a woman who is part of one of our communities, our missional communities, who for more than 20 years lived with addiction, who's on a journey with Jesus now. And, that lit my fire like no, financial report or board paper could ever do. It's those stories of transformation of lives changed by Jesus that will forever be the thing that I strive for and reach for.
Yeah. I mean, Stu, when I think about your time with me, one of the biggest lessons I've learned from you is that people matter, and that people matter to God. And I can always remember, every time I think of your leadership, I remember that you would always, your heart breaks over the things that God's heart breaks over, and your heart rejoices over the thing that God's heart rejoices over. I'm conscious of time. We only have a limited amount of time with you today, Stu. Well, I would love to ask you one last question. Yeah. Let's say there's someone listening today that's struggling in their relationship with Jesus. They're questioning whether they keep going. They're questioning whether it's worth it. And they've stumbled across this podcast and they've listened to this point. If you could give them an encouragement, what would you say to someone feeling distant from God today?
What I'd say is this: God knows, God sees, and God cares. He really does. It may not feel like that right now, but God's eye is on the sparrow, and if his eye is on the sparrow, his eye is on you, and that you are the apple of his eye. He is closer to you than you could possibly imagine, and his heart is for you, that his heart is broken for you, and he sees every tear that falls from your eye, and he bottles it up, the scriptures tell us. And that God is not distant. His arms are not folded. He's not turned his back on you, and that you will experience his loving embrace. It won't just be in theory, it will be in practice. And I know that moment is coming sooner than you could possibly expect. And so my encouragement to you would be to know that first and foremost. And secondly, to bring your pain, to bring your vulnerability to him, to cry out to God like so many women and men, like I have done in the past, and that God, you will meet God in that cry. I know that will happen.
Yeah. Stu, that's beautiful. I just want to honor you. I often say to people, I am the man I am today because of you. I don't think we catch up nearly as much as we should. But to interview on this podcast today is because we really wanted to highlight your voice as not only a leader in this nation, but as a spiritual father to many. And so I really appreciate you sharing time with us on the Becoming podcast.
No, my privilege, Mike. Yeah.
I mean, no one knows this. I'll finish with this thought, but our mission statement as a church, more people, more like Jesus, came from you on platform riffing off what the Spirit was doing in a moment. And I remember you said, it's all about becoming more like Jesus, more people, more like Jesus. And it's like our whole church sat up in that moment and said, that's it. That's our heart. And today, this whole Becoming podcast is actually inspired from that mission statement. So your legacy is on living on and strong, Stu. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, brother. Been great.
We'll chat soon. Well, welcome back, friends. It's good to have you with us again. That was a beautiful conversation with Stu, Jess.
So good.
Yeah. What stood out to you? What did you love?
So many things, but I loved, like, even just the beginning of the conversation, how he honed in about the significance of mentorship. And you asked that like really beautiful question towards the end of, there's been scandal and that, people can run their race wrong or, fall from grace. And the idea of like cultivating your relationship with God is just not you and you alone, but really growing your community and having key figures in your life, key mentors in your life to guide you down that narrow path, to tell you, hey, you're swaying this way and you need to come back, or hey, I don't think that's the right path for you and I don't think that's the right path that God's calling you to. I love that. And journaling, like, that's awesome. Like I thought journaling needs to be in everyone's spiritual practice. I know he said that, it's different for everyone, but I loved how he communes with God in that spiritual practice.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
How about you?
I mean, the journaling thing for me is one of the things I remember the most about Stu.
Yeah.
But I've also been front and center when I've seen Stu go through some really dark times.
Yeah.
And I've sat with him and we've cried together. We've talked together, and who he says he is who Stu actually is.
Yeah.
And I've seen it. And he has been one of the most integrous, faith-filled men that I've known over my life.
Yeah.
And he's just in love with Jesus. So I think when he talks about this stuff, it's because he knows. So I think it's a great encouragement today. And I hope if you're listening to the podcast today that you are encouraged, that there's something that stirs for you. And if you would like to reach out to anyone, please reach out to us at hello@church.nu. Or Jess, if they want to do more with the podcast, what can they do?
They can subscribe to our podcast. You can check us out on church.nu/becoming. And let us know what other topics that you'd like us to explore with you on your journey. Because we want to, Newlife just wants to be with you on that journey with Jesus.
As we see more people becoming more like Christ. We'll talk to you guys next time.
Thanks for listening. We hope we passed on some valuable knowledge on how you can become and lead a life more like Jesus. If this message inspired you, please make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single podcast, or share it with a friend. And for more information and resources on what we discussed today, please visit church.nu/becoming. See you next time, and God bless.